We're here today chatting with Simon McLean. Simon is a retired police detective and is founder of and currently leads the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, or LEAP, in Scotland. Simon has written a book called The 10%, The Truth, the Whole Truth, and Something Like the Truth about his life and experiences as a police officer. So we're very pleased to have Simon here today to talk to us about LEAP Scotland and his experiences in the police. So Simon, just to start us off, do you want to just tell us what LEAP is and why did you decide to found LEAP Scotland?
Okay, thanks David, and thanks for having me on board. Yeah, LEAP, I didn't know anything about LEAP until 2 years ago, and it was my memoir, which I should say is the first half of my police career. Starting off in uniform, obviously, as a rookie, and becoming a crime squad detective, and thereafter going into plain clothes in different areas of mainly Glasgow. And that was really at the start of the drugs marketplace opening up in Scotland in the 80s, in the early 80s, late 70s. So when I wrote the book, it's the first half of my career. It doesn't cover the second half when I worked with agencies, law enforcement agencies, more as an undercover officer, which I'll come back to later on, no doubt. And when lockdown came along, I had started a memoir. I had started a book because a friend of mine is a publisher and he'd encouraged me. And during lockdown, it seemed the perfect time, out of boredom more than anything else, to finish it off, or else I might still be. Because I quite enjoyed saying that I was an author. I quite enjoyed saying that my book was in progress. My horror was that I would finish it and then it wouldn't get published and I would no longer be able to say I was an author. But anyway, it was published in September 2 years ago now. And as a result of the book, I was invited to go and speak at different promotional events and a true crime podcast on YouTube with a lad, Sean Atwood, down in Liverpool, who has about 1 million subscribers, I think. So that was a great opportunity, which I enjoyed thoroughly. And during the course of that 4-hour interview, as it transpired, Sean made me aware of LEAP, which I had known nothing about until then. I had thought that I was quite unique as a police officer, thinking from an early stage that we were really wasting our time as far as enforcement of our drug laws were concerned, that being the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971 that we worked under. Even as a young cop, even in the early days, in the first 6 months or a year of having great success enforcing these laws and seizures and putting people away in prison, it was pretty obvious within a few months that it was just a merry-go-round, that we weren't actually affecting. In fact, we were affecting the marketplace, but not in a positive way. We were making things worse and continue to do so until this day. So when I spoke to Sean Atwood during the interview, actually during the interview, he tells me that there's an organisation called LEAP. And after the interview, he gave me the contact details and I got in touch with LEAP UK. Neil Woods was the chairman of it at that time, and realised that there are lots and lots of retired police officers. There are now lots and lots of serving police officers, some of them in very senior positions, sheriffs, judges, lawyers, and the list grows daily of our supporters, because we're out there speaking to different groups all the time who realise that our current drug laws are the problem rather than any solution. And that realisation started LEAP Scotland in January 2021, and we now have our own organisation, albeit under the umbrella of LEAP UK, LEAP Europe, LEAP USA. It's a global organisation growing daily, and I go around the country, and one of us is going to Holland next month to speak. We spoke to the Superintendents Association here in Scotland. So we're busy trying to change minds. The politics is the stumbling block, of course, David.
How big is LEAP in Scotland? Just out of curiosity, is it in terms of how many of you are there? Is it just yourself at the moment mainly, or?
No, we've got, I would say we've got half a dozen active members, but we've got hundreds of followers. And the trouble is to activate people, to give them something to do. Really, it's a social media campaign. I don't know if you're aware, but Paul Sweeney, MSP of the Labour Party, is putting a bill in front of the Scottish Parliament in coming months about safe consumption. And that really is he wants to make it a non-political venture that will involve politicians from all sides of the fence. But the reason I mention that is that when something like that comes up, we can then activate the people who agree with us, but we've got nothing for them to do on a day-to-day basis. We invite them to meetings, we have seminars online. It's a bit of an echo chamber because we're always bringing new people in, but we're always saying the same things, but expanding all the time. And the likes of the survey that Paul has got out just now, which I'll send you the link to after our meeting here, is asking questions to the general public about mainly safe consumption and what do we do about drug deaths in Scotland, which are horrific, obviously.
We'll include that in the show notes of the podcast. What I was going to ask you next was quite a general question, and you've touched on it a wee bit. And just before I get you to answer, I'll maybe just sort of mention a couple of bits that might stimulate some thoughts, although I'm sure you have many in any case. So the question is, do our current drug laws make communities safer or more dangerous places? And before I get you to answer, it was just to mention a few bits here. So one was that in Chasing the Scream, Johann Hari talked about that there's not just a war on drugs, but that war on drugs causes a war for drugs. So in other words, it kind of results in gang wars, turf wars, violence increasing, a kind of arms race of violence, because it gives competitive advantage to gangsters to be more violent. And also looking at kind of evidence in terms of sort of broader safety and I suppose going into health, that when people become drug pushers, drug users tend to become drug pushers. So it tends to sort of foment more people becoming getting introduced to drugs and becoming addicted, which I guess we probably see in the alcohol industry, to be fair, even in a regulated market. But in the unregulated market, you're seeing people who are using drugs ending up having to become dealers to fund their habit sometimes as well. So question is, are communities safer with our current drug laws or more dangerous?
Well, the simple answer is there's absolutely no question or debate about it in my mind. And all the evidence, we always hear the mantra of politicians and lots of others now is, well, we're evidence-led. It shows the evidence. And they send a task force away for 2 or 3 years to come back with some evidence, by which time they've forgotten why they asked for it in the first place. Because the evidence is all around us. You only have to take a walk down some of our streets and you'll see it. So the question is a resounding that our attempts at enforcing our ancient drug laws cause much, I'm tempted to say all, but they underpin every aspect of criminality in our communities and in our housing schemes and in our world, in our society, from the very lowest crimes, such as environmental crimes, such as money lending on the high streets within our communities, such as shoplifting, from that end of the scale of crime, through the sex industry, through every level and tier of criminality, right to undermining our very establishments and governments and law enforcement and justice and democracy that we rely on as founding stones of the society we live in. And that's global. So the answer, I couldn't be any more emphatic about the effect of law enforcement in the drugs industry, from the very lowest to the very top scale in our society. And these problems are well documented. And the irony is that the more resources we throw at it from an enforcement point of view, the worse it gets. So we're really throwing fuel in the fire all the time. I said to you that we had a meeting with the chief police officers of Scotland. They invited us to do a presentation. And we thought long and hard. I say we because myself and a few ex-inspectors, ex-chief inspectors and whatnot, we put our heads together and we wanted to make it obviously as effective as we could. So we decided to make it quite poignant and ask all these senior police officers who are the backbone and decision makers within our police in Scotland to do one thing. And their 20-minute pitch, which went on for half an hour, was well received. And the only one thing we asked them to do, David, was to tell the truth. And they got that, because every time we see the media saying the police have seized X amount of drugs or arrested X amount of people, that's portrayed as positive news. For the communities affected by these seizures and arrests, it's not positive news at all, because it's just triggered a whole range of incidents and battles and striving for the market, because it's the market we have to address. I heard a lovely quote the other day that I remembered deliberately because I knew I was meeting you today, and it was that law enforcement in the drugs world doesn't change the size of the market, it only changes the shape of the market. And I thought that was very poignant for what we're talking about today. Nobody goes without their drugs because of law enforcement. That dent in supply that we sometimes make now and again, and it is a dent, doesn't mean that anybody is going to go without their drugs that day. All it means is that maybe the price has gone up and maybe somebody else has moved into the supply line, and they do that through the fist. I wish it was only the fist, but they'll use any means to secure that share of the marketplace because it's worth so much money.
Can I get an image of Terminator 2 and the liquid Terminator where you shot him and he just...
David, you're a real film buff, aren't you?
Came back together.
Out more. Every time I mention something, you're liking it.
I felt yeah. But yeah, I kind of, point on that, I guess, is that a lot of the time, so you mentioned that obviously if the police do have some successes, it changes the shape of the market and can actually cause real problems for drug users in terms of health problems as well, if they're not able to get the drugs they need, which could potentially lead to other incidents, like you say. But it's also that thing of do the drug gangs even care that they've lost some drugs? Because from what I understand, a lot of the time, they're happy to let the police have a few wins if it lets.
The truth of the matter is, and this is getting near to the nitty-gritty, is that in the world of intelligence, criminal intelligence and organised crime, and the forces that we have put in place to fight against all of what I've just mentioned, which couldn't be any better than they are. We've got top guys, we've got top equipment, we've got top systems in place to do this. We're very, very good at it. It's just a pity we're doing the wrong thing and wasting all that resource in the wrong way. But the problem with it, I think, is that it's an in for the police to the whole criminal world. It gives them a lever to enter into the whole criminal world, make some arrests and get information and intelligence about what on paper are bigger matters. It might be importation, it might be slavery, it might be importing girls for the sex industry into the country. It could be major fraud, it could be terrorism, it could be something that's perceived as much more important than drugs. But the drugs market is a way for the police to get into the criminal world and have some leverage to get the information that keeps us all safe at the end of the day.
But of course, like you said, the drugs market funds a lot of these activities like human trafficking and terrorism. So it may be a kind of way in, but it's that way. If you removed it, maybe there wouldn't be so much of the other types of crime you mentioned.
Yeah.
So you actually said something there that brings us nicely into my next question, which is that you mentioned that police have the best equipment. They're really well trained. They're getting better and better at catching drug gangs. And this was actually a quote from another book, which I was reading recently, called Revolting Prostitutes, which was focusing on the sex trade, but it was mentioning about the fact that you can't really separate the war on drugs from the sex trade. So the quote was from an undercover police officer who said, "Every year, police get better at catching drug gangs, and the gangsters' most effective way of fighting back is upping the use of fear and intimidation against potential informants. The most efficient way to stop people grassing them up is to be terrifying. In other words, organised crime groups were getting nastier and nastier as a result of what I was doing. It's a classic arms race." Now, you mentioned earlier as well that you kind of had come to the conclusion that you were wasting your time as a policeman trying to make a dent in this. Do you get a sense or what was your sense before you retired, of where the police are now with that? Do you think there's a kind of tipping point coming where more police are beginning to think that they're wasting their time here?
I think the tipping point, David, is and maybe unusual for anyone listening, but once they think about it, they'll realise what lies behind it, is that the police in this country rely on the cooperation of our communities, of our society. We police by consent, and that is a foundation of our police force. We don't carry weapons all the time. We do more and more now, but ostensibly we're unarmed, and we police by consent. That consent is built on respect and trust. And we see an undermining of that now in different aspects of police activity. I'm thinking about the Met, and primarily when I'm talking about that with some of the highlighted incidents over the last few years. But the more we try to enforce unfair and unjust and mostly ineffective laws, the more we undermine that trust in the police. For example, police officers, well, I'll give you a great example. I remember as a young uniform cop working with the serious crime squad on a murder down in Argyll in a wee village called Tarbert in Lochfine. And the murder was 2 years old. It was the murder of a girl called Anna Kenny in Glasgow, and her body had been found in Skipness, not far from Tarbert. And I was part of the door-knocking, house-chapping, house-to-house team that the Serious Crime Squad put out in uniform with a clipboard to try and garner some information of 2 years ago. So what we had was newspaper clippings and what was on TV, things that could jog people's memories about 2 years before, in the hope that we could get some inkling of a stranger in town or whatever it might have been. And while I only had about a year's service at the time, and while we were doing that, I was going to doors, and somebody would open the door, see the uniform and tell me where to go in no uncertain terms, and shut the door again. And that's quite unusual in a village like Tarbert. But what was happening was that the traffic department had decided to set up a speed trap just outside the village, just at the 30-mile-an-hour sign at the top of the hill. And they were sitting with their speed gun, booking people for doing 35 mile an hour or 36 mile an hour as they came into the village, giving them a ticket. And then we're going round the door asking them to help us with a murder inquiry from 2 years before. And the two things are at total odds with each other. And the same applies now when police officers are seizing small quantities of whatever, but especially cannabis, I would suggest, because there's a general acceptance within the police and general society that cannabis is a much less harmful drug than alcohol even, or perhaps tobacco, that it does have a place in our society for people medicinally as well as recreationally. And for the police to be enforcing laws in connection with cannabis has the opposite effect. And that might be the trigger point that the police realise that they need to address these things with the government and with the courts in order to retain the tools that make police effective in the first place. That was quite long-winded. Did it make sense?
No, it made absolute sense, and it kind of leads into something that I'd been reading recently. So I was doing some research, obviously, prior to this interview, and it was the Runciman report in 2000. So as far back as that, the Runciman report had noted that, I'll just quote it. It says, "There can be no doubt that in implementing the law, The present concentration on cannabis weakens the respect for the law. It gives large numbers of otherwise law-abiding people a criminal record. It inordinately penalises and marginalises young people for what might be little more than youthful experimentation. It bears most.
Sorry, on you go.
So I'm just going to say it bears most heavily on young people in the streets and cities who are more likely to be poor and members of minority ethnic communities. The evidence strongly indicates that the current law and its operation creates more harm than the drug itself. So in other words, everything you said there.
That can affect your job prospects, educational prospects. Every prospect in life can be underpinned by that daft conviction, including your right to travel throughout the world. Maybe something that you did as an 18-year-old at university or wherever. It does underpin it quite nicely. The police invented the traffic wardens department many years ago in order to take the flack away from the police for issuing parking tickets and doing people for being on a meter for 10 minutes too long. And that was to take that hatred away from the police that is now directed towards the poor traffic wardens. But you can see the principle. They made the traffic police, gave them their white hats and fancy cars, so that the police didn't have to deal with, because the public perceive traffic offences as unjust mostly when they're the victim of the charge. So that was why the traffic department and then the traffic wardens department. So maybe we need a drugs department now. We can take away from the police.
Well, I guess, although I suppose it even with any, even if you do that, you still undermine trust in law enforcement and the law itself. Yeah. If you're seen to either be pursuing or enforcing unjust laws that disproportionately target or seem to target certain communities. So I don't know if you get the problem, if you move maybe you just change the shape of the problem. That's it.
Exactly. One of the problems we have, I think, I was listening to a thing the other day about how change comes about with bad law. And maybe 51 years ago now, when President Nixon announced the war on drugs and created this problem for us, maybe back then it seemed that we might have some success with it, but surely now we must realise that we need to change our approach. The problem with changing laws is that it's generally in this country contrived by one person or a group of people breaking the law publicly, en masse sometimes. I'm thinking of Tommy Sheridan and people like that who have gone to prison in order to prove the point that the law is wrong and has to be changed. And the trouble is, you'll never get leap doing that because by our very nature, we wouldn't do that. We wouldn't break the law to make the point. We wouldn't all sit outside number 10 smoking cannabis or something, because none of us could go to prison. That's the truth of the matter. We wouldn't last 2 minutes.
Yeah. We mentioned that before, and off camera you'd mentioned about Peter Crycan and the drug consumption room.
Yeah, spoke to him this morning actually. I speak to him regularly.
Well, do you want to tell us a wee bit about what did Peter do there?
Well, that was a good example of that one man, because he was the one man in Glasgow, I'm not in recovery. Peter is in recovery. I'm getting the jargon as I go along. And a great guy, but Peter took it upon himself. He was so upset by friends and the people on the streets and the drug figures, the Scottish drug deaths figures, that he got an old ambulance and converted it into a safe place, a consumption room, as you would call it, a safe consumption room. And he took it into the streets of Glasgow and parked it quite discreetly in the centre of the city. And over the period of hours and days, people who use drugs got to know about him and eventually trusted to go there. And the long and the short of it was that Peter saved 8 lives through doing that with people that might otherwise have passed away with overdoses. And during the course of that, the police came and visited him umpteen times. And on one occasion, they charged him with obstruction. He was in the ambulance with a drug user and didn't give the police immediate access that they demanded. So they charged him with obstruction, which we were all delighted about. I don't think Peter was that delighted at the time, but we were, because it was a chance for us to shine a light on it. It was a chance for the courts to make some proclamation. It was a chance for the justice system to be forced to look at it, because what the police always hate, and I've never spoke to a policeman about this, but I know it in my bones, that we hate grey areas. We like clear cut. We like laws that make things clear cut, good and bad, if you like, black and white, if you like, but not grey areas. So Peter was charged, and the Procurator Fiscal a month or so later wrote to him and offered him a warning. And Peter was upset about that, spoke to his lawyer, whatnot. Ostensibly, on the face of it, that looked like a good result for Peter because he wasn't getting prosecuted. But he chose to decline that because, again, he wanted to make the point. He wanted it to go higher. He wanted it to go to a court of appeal or the Court of Human Rights or wherever it could end up. But unfortunately, the Procurator Fiscal, having offered a warning, then decided to drop it entirely. So there's no crime. So the police had charged him with something that they saw, they had the evidence to charge him for, and the Procurator Fiscal chose to treat it as no crime had been committed. So all we've got is a grey area that Peter had created, whereas we could have had, if we'd been brave enough to go forward, we could have had proper debate about it in a court of law.
And you'd mentioned that before to me, kind of before we were chatting today, and the only problem, I guess, with that system of laws being challenged by concerned citizens is it places a huge burden on an individual, sometimes in Peter's case, to take all of that on, the stress of being processed through the criminal justice system.
And he became the focus of all the media attention. He became the focus when the drug deaths figures came out. I went through to Holyrood and met him. We had the caravan. He had the caravan there, and I did some filming. And we must have been 6, maybe 8 hours of constant barrage from all angles, from the press, from some politicians. There was maybe a handful that came out because the cameras were there, probably, David. But that was just a wee window into what Peter's life became at that time, because it's a horrible position to be in, especially as a recovering drug addict at that point, with a young family and all the things that he's put in place as part of his recovery. It took a terrible toll on him, but he's now back. I spoke to him only this morning, and he was offering to come and speak at an event that LEAP are putting on later this year.
That's great. And no, I definitely, I mean, I did mention to you before, I'm a recovering alcoholic. And it certainly in recovery circles is said that stress kills addicts because it often is the trigger for using, whether it's alcohol, drugs, whatever it is. So it does feel unfair to place that burden on somebody like Peter when the government could just truly take an evidence-based approach in the first place.
Because it's all there. And that's what we said to the police as well. There's nobody better placed than the chief officers in the police force for evidence-led. They've got all the figures about drug use. We know the types of drugs that are being used. We've got nearly all the figures. The only more figures we need is if we regulated this industry, we would actually know who needs the help at the front line. We would meet them day and daily when they come to get their supply. And you've touched on another huge issue there. We've got a chap, Graham Golden, as part of LEAP. He's based in Edinburgh. And Graham's a retired chief inspector who worked the last 8 years of his career in the violence reduction unit. And we've discovered that there's lots of commonality there. There's lots of strands of what we're trying to do, as there are with other organisations. But the principles and the methodology that was laid down years ago for violence reduction, which has been hugely successful across the country and further, feed nicely into what we're trying to do here, is to help people instead. And that's where the regulation comes in, David, is we can then provide the help and support to signpost people to other choices in their lives. Because you and I know from what you've just told me that those choices are made because of factors in their lives that they lose control of and have nothing, maybe abuse, or maybe haven't been brought up in care. We could go on all day about the reasons why people, and there's a commonality there. It's not a life choice. I don't think anybody wakes up in the morning and thinks, I think I'll drink a bottle of whiskey today, or go and shoot up heroin and see what it's like. It's a sliding slope in their life, and the drugs becomes the crutch or the escape from that reality.
I mean, certainly I've been to hundreds, if not thousands, of AA meetings by now, and the common theme seems to be trauma. And similarly, it's like you mentioned, in violence reduction and crime, we tend to see that there's a background of trauma. Even obviously among serial killers, we often tend to see that actually they've had very traumatic childhoods. So it's how you treat children is important in this country as well. If you want to avoid these problems.
And we've got the child abuse inquiries going on just now, but we could go on all day about that as well. And how we could sit down, and that's what LEAP are really advocating more than anything. People say, oh, you want to legalize this, you want to regulate that. What we want to do is sit and have a grown-up conversation about it. That's really it. Instead of all the rhetoric and all the mantras, like I heard one yesterday on Twitter, I think it was, I didn't hear it, that people just need to grow up and take responsibility for themselves and stop using drugs. And that's the end of it. That's the answer to everything. A total missed the point entirely. And
it's a particular ideology of individual responsibility, which of course there has to be an element of when you're an adult, but it's understanding that thing that our ability to take responsibility is shaped by so many factors. And some of us don't grow up maybe the way or at the stages we should, and a lot of the time that is influenced by life circumstances.
Your environment.
So
and the hand that you're dealt in the first place very often.
So we all understand this, and it's frustrating that it's so well understood, and yet it doesn't seem to translate into policy a lot of the time. The United Nations Office for Drug Control estimates about 90% of people who use drugs do so recreationally. I mean, we've just talked there a lot about trauma, but we've talked about dependence, addiction. But dependence and addiction is actually only about 10% of the story. The other 90% is just people wanting to have a good time. Much like it is with alcohol, where
having a pint on the way home from work with your colleagues, or a glass of wine watching TV at night, or whatever it might be.
And so it's bizarre probably that we treat alcohol that way, and yet if someone has a drug of choice that is different, you mentioned cannabis, but it could be ecstasy, MDMA, cocaine even, that we look at it differently. I think I sent you a news article about an approach taken in the Netherlands at the moment, or that is being explored in the Netherlands, where they're looking at a pilot for a shop that might sell ecstasy legally. Because I guess as well, you sound as if you're in favour very much of legalising and regulating drugs, but of course we would need to be very careful about how we do that, because we need to understand what the unintended consequences might be. So what do you think?
I think an important point in there is that there's so many people coming to it from a different angle, and we have to remember that my angle, you can only come at it from your perspective. You can only see the world through your own perspective, your own lens. And we're very much coming at that from a law enforcement point of view, David. We want to cut the criminals off at their knees. We want to change the market, not the shape of it. We want to take control of the marketplace, because we can see the harm that giving that marketplace to criminals is doing. So although we're talking about recovery here, and we're talking about resources and rehabilitation, those those words don't slide easily, or they didn't slide easily off my tongue until a couple of years ago when I started to see the big picture. But primarily, we want to still we still want to destroy the marketplaces of the criminals. That's where LEAP are coming from.
Yep, and certainly we kind of talked before as well about the fact that it just seems a bit ridiculous, the idea of criminalising people for having a good time in the first place, which would be nuts if you suggested to someone that for drinking a pint of lager, i.e. using drugs, you should be criminalised, which, by the way, the UK government, you might be aware, are proposing to increase criminal penalties for drug use at the moment. And just how obscene that seems, but also then from the law enforcement perspective, and this was my other movie reference that was The Untouchables,
Right,
and where you see a lot of police officers killed throughout the course of this movie. Now, obviously, it's a movie based on true events. Lots of police officers did die in prohibition of alcohol in the United States, and trying to stop alcohol getting into the United States. And you can't help but laugh, as I just did, at the notion that of how ridiculous it is that police officers would be getting killed to stop people having a drink, a social drink, and yet we're doing the exact same thing with drugs, which aren't particularly harmful in a lot of cases.
There's two things there, David, that I'd like to highlight. One is that you're talking about a movie. You obviously spend your life watching box sets and movies, but there's a reality there that is true today and was true 50 years ago, and it's more pronounced now. The more money, the more resources, the more we clamp down, the heavier the sentences become, the more seizures we make, the more deaths we cause on the streets, and the more deaths and destruction of lives we see of law enforcement agencies as well. And that's real. Not just cops killed on duty, but the undercover world takes a terrible toll on individuals. I hardly speak about working undercover. I speak about the first part of my career, which was open and everybody knows about. But the reason is that I've spent years forgetting it and putting it out of my consciousness, because it's not a place that you want to visit. It's the margins of society where there are no rules and there are no laws. And we have got hundreds, if not thousands, of police officers and agents working in those places, whether it's customs, whether it's drug enforcement, whether it's National Crime Agency, on all of it, whether it's the terrorist squads, whoever it is, they're on the front line having to live lives that nobody would ever choose to live in order to keep us safe from these things. So there's a really, really serious part to what you say. And also, you said that the criminalisation of people, and if we could only educate, the government are great at talking about educating about drugs as if that's going to make any difference. What we should be educating about is why we got this drugs war in the first place. And I know that you're aware of there's lots of literature, there's lots of confessions, if you like, of advisors who were part of Bush's administration at the time. The reasons we had these drug laws enforced upon us and adopted here were very, very specific about criminalising people, groups of people and communities in order to stay in power, in order to retain power in 1970.
Well, and even before that, because as Johann Hari sort of points out in his book Chasing the Scream, that Harry Anslinger was the guy who sort of founded the precursor to the Drug Enforcement Agency in the US. And Harry Anslinger was a racist who basically pursued Buddy Holly to death. And so I mean the war on drugs started as early as maybe the 1920s in the USA, and was a racist war about controlling the Black American population, really, who predominantly smoked cannabis or other drugs rather than drinking alcohol. In order to get votes, to show that they were hard on the blacks, if you like. And I think we kind of touched on it before about how some people sort of talk about how that slavery was never abolished; it was just moved into mass incarceration of black people through drug laws.
Yeah.
So there's that element to it as well. You mentioned. On you go.
Okay, you mentioned about regulation. What I just wanted to clarify what LEAP, the three things that we are advocating through discussion and to get the politics out of it. LEAP is an apolitical organisation. It's a charity actually, and those three things are that decriminalisation of people, drugs and people, because that's the root of the problem, and it's what Nixon did. It's what was done throughout that period, was to criminalise people for their own purposes. The second part of it then, and that's no use without the second and third part. They're interlinked. We don't want, a cop said to me a few weeks ago, so you just want drugs to be available on the streets? People can just go and buy them, they can just, and the police can't do anything about it. I said, no, that's not what I want. That's what it is just now. Your kids can go and buy them anywhere they like right now, and you don't know anything about it. We want to do the opposite. We want to legalise it, decriminalise it, and regulate it properly. And that would be a system of regulation that people much cleverer than I, David, will sit down and come up with, to look at the different classifications of drugs and the different potencies. The great thing we haven't spoke about is that if we regulate it, we then know its source. We then know where it comes from. We then know what's in it. We know the strength of it and potency, which we've got no control over right now. We leave that to the criminals to decide what they put in it.
And we can also give out more accurate harm reduction information because we know what's in the drug, whereas just now we can give out harm reduction information, but at the end of the day, we're giving out the best information we can. We still don't know what people are taking.
No, and if they're unconscious, if they're overdosing, we've no idea what's in them without a lot of testing and whatnot. So there's that aspect. And the third aspect, if you like, well, the safe consumption is a big part of all of that, but it's a big part of the third part of the equation, which is then to provide safety nets through, we now regulate, so we know where people are getting the drugs mostly, and we know who they are, and we can then signpost them towards places where they can get the right help and support to make differences in their lives, which we've already discussed, that caused them to use drugs in the first place, mostly homelessness, poverty, lack of education, the communities that they're part of, which is a big part of it has been the culture that they're living in. I think it was you that said to me before that in Copenhagen, they have a laundry, they have a few laundry machines that people can come in. It's a safe consumption room, but it's a safe place. And they can get a wash, they can meet with other people who are maybe in a similar position, they can get advice and guidance and maybe change their lives. Certainly a better chance of it than buying some unknown substance on a street corner or up a lane from a total stranger that doesn't give a jot about them.
And who may try to recruit you into selling the drugs as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So the shop in I think it's in Amsterdam, this pilot, the ecstasy shop, shows how that could be done, where it was suggesting that there would be people would be made to fill in a questionnaire, made to watch a short video on the risks of ecstasy before they purchased it, and details would be taken and a proper exchange. What I found amusing with that was I was trying to picture a world in which you go into a pub and you've got to fill out a questionnaire and watch a harm reduction video about alcohol. But again, that's no more ridiculous, and you could make an argument that might actually be a good idea, given how much crime and health problems alcohol causes.
Yes, to families, to the damage it does in the workplace, to families, but then we could go down that road with gambling, we could go down that road with lots of vices that people, the one road we can't go down is to say you can't do that anymore, because gambling was only made legal in the 50s. Up until then, there was no gambling in the world at all, because we said it was bad. What I found quite amusing, you can always edit this anyway, David, was that apparently the people who facilitated gambling before the legalization, I think it was 58 or 59, it was made legal. the people who facilitated it with runners and with backstreet shops and whatnot became the lords of gambling. I'm talking about guys who actually became lords on the back of the businesses they built in gambling. I don't need to mention their names. It's the names of all our bookmakers in the country. They became very respectable, wealthy people who had been illegally running gambling up until it became regulated.
And you mentioned about how drugs feeds into all types of crime, because of course in America it was effectively gangsters who founded Las Vegas.
Right? Yeah.
So
for sure. Oh, let's not go down the mafia road. We'll be here all day.
Yeah.
Because poverty is the one thing we haven't really spoken about today, and it's the one thing that you know how you obviously read books the same as I do, and sometimes a film or a book relates perfectly to the point that you're thinking about at the time. Well, it was the mafia for me a few months ago that I was watching the old Godfather films again. And now we're going through tricky times with the energy bills and inflation and the cost of living and all the rest of it. There's real hardship round the corner. And it's not even round the corner for a lot of people. It's here. It's here and now. The food banks, we're getting, I'm involved with a football club as well, and we're getting appeals for foodstuffs and whatnot. So you can see it all starting to take place. And that kind of vacuum that's created by poverty is filled by criminals. That's when they move in, because they can offer you an out. They can offer you £100 to tide you by until the end of the week, to feed the kids or to pay a bill. But there's a heavy, heavy price to pay there, David.
Yeah. And I think that's a good place to leave it, Simon. We're almost out of time, but really important point on poverty. Especially, it was in the news recently about county lines gangs that preying on children who are from more deprived areas as well. But yeah, we'll need to leave it there because
I did a talk for a Rotary last week, and I used that because it was in the news, and they were totally ignorant of it. No idea what I was talking about. So it just shows that there's this divide of the real world and what we're led to believe and what we're focusing on.
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to have to say leave it there for now. So thank you very much, Simon, for doing this with us, and we'll be glad to work with you in the future.
David, thank you. So much to talk about. We should do a series.
It would be a good, no doubt. We could, I'm sure.
Thanks, David.